On the morning of June 1st, 1858, 50 prominent American artists boarded a train at the Camden Street Depot in Baltimore. They were guests of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the proud owner of what few had thought possible, a rail line over the Allegheny Mountains.
The B&O was, in many regards, a high-stakes gamble. I would equate it to deciding in the late 1950s to go to the moon. The people here didn't have the technology, didn't have the engineering, didn't have the knowledge to really know they could get across those mountains. Deciding to do that was an act of faith and courage, as much as a hard-headed business decision.
Now the B&O wanted to call attention to its achievement by sending artists on an excursion. One car had been converted into a darkroom. Easels and writing tables filled 2 cars. The dining car was outfitted with a piano, sofas, and cases of champagne. Officials encouraged the artists to stop the train any time so they could paint or photograph whatever impressed them.
This is the first time in this country anything like this had ever been done. And the railroads were looking around for ways to increase their visibility to get business. We didn't have advertising agencies then. We didn't have any of these modern notions of shaping public opinion. The railroad, I suppose, was trying to exploit these artists. The artists apparently didn't feel exploited at all. They thought they were taking advantage of the railroad.
It cannot be that the brightest, busiest, and freest people on earth who have built this vast temple to civilization in the western wilderness will ever rest until the work crowned by the ennobling hand of art.
David Hunter Strother.
Among the artists was David Hunter Strother of Martinsburg, Virginia. Strother had studied art in New York and Europe, painted portraits to support himself, then returned home broke and despondent. He abandoned painting and began writing and illustrating travel stories for Harper's Magazine under the pen name Port Crayon. The stories were immensely popular. Strother soon became one of the highest paid writers in America.
As the train commenced ascending the mountain, a number of the excursionists took their seats on the cowcatcher for obtaining a better view of the grand scenes which were opening before them. The groups of lofty firs near at hand, silvery streamlets flashing through somber thickets of evergreen, the gorgeous bouquets of azalea and mountain honeysuckle that recalled the luxuriance of the tropics.
This was a safari to them. They were bringing back images and impressions of a land that was only vaguely known to the 90% of the population that lived within 20 miles of the East Coast. What they came back with were a series of photographs and sketches, paintings, drawings that showed the wilderness being opened by the railroad. We were making this place useful to human beings, and these artists recognized that. That's how they represented this, that the railroad was good, or at least the railroad was neutral, and it was allowing people to go west in a way that they hadn't been able to before.
"380 miles from Baltimore, the train pulled to a stop at Wheeling, where the artists were greeted with cannon fire and taken on a tour of the town.
Wheeling is like many a child we've seen that would be very pretty if its face was washed. David Hunter Strother.
It was a town that had a dichotomy of society. There was very high society who lived in grand homes. Some had slaves as house servants. And so people were living very well, going to theater, going to concerts, going to scholarly lectures. They were enjoying the finer things of life. But that was only a select group in the community. And then there was the other side of the coin, the laborers and the wagoneers who drank a lot, who fought a lot, the people who did not have much money and worked so hard, were ill, led what we would consider miserable lives.
The idiosyncrasy of this town is smoke. It rolls sullenly from the great chimneys of the iron foundries and settles down in black, slimy pools on the muddy streets. Smoke on the wharfs, smoke on the dingy boats, on the yellow river. Clinging in a coat of greasy soot to the house front, the faded poplars, the faces of the passers-by. Rebecca Harding.
She was curious, sensitive, and remarkably observant. Raised in an upper-class home, Rebecca Harding became fascinated with the working-class life outside her window. In her early 20s, she began to write about it.
A cloudy day. Do you know what that is in a town of ironworks? The air is thick, clammy with the breath of crowded human beings. It stifles me. I open the window and can scarcely see through the rain the grocer's shop opposite, where a crowd of drunken Irishmen are puffing Lynchburg tobacco in their pipes. I can detect the scent through all the foul smells ranging loose in the air.
In her steel-ribbed corsets and dragging skirts, Harding explored Wheeling's gritty industrial districts. Thousands of Irish, Welsh, and German laborers toiled.
Masses of men with dull faces bent to the ground. Skin and muscle and flesh begrimed with smoke and ashes, stooping all night over boiling cauldrons of metal, breathing from infancy to death an air saturated with fog and grease and soot, vileness for soul and body.
Harding's story, Life in the Iron Mills, published in the Atlantic Monthly, shocked readers across the country. It was the first time that an American writer had portrayed industrialism in such realistic terms. Southerners claimed it showed that working conditions in northern factories were worse than those on plantations. As the slavery conflict intensified, Western Virginia, with its slave and free labor, became a border between two ways of life. On a warm spring day in 1859, Rebecca Harding saw a gaunt man walking down a street in Wheeling. His eyes fixed and lips moving, she noted, like a man under the influence of morphia. He was a poor farmer from the West, Harding wrote in her diary, who was insane on the question of slavery. A few days later, the man left town, heading east. On the night of October 16th, 1859, John Brown and 18 followers crossed the Potomac River into Harper's Ferry, Virginia. There they easily seized the federal armory and arsenal, took a half-dozen prisoners, then barricaded themselves in the arsenal engine house. Little else in Brown's life had gone as smoothly. He had roamed through 6 states, failed as a cattleman, merchant, and land speculator, fathered 20 children, and fallen deeply into debt. Yet Brown felt God had given him a special mission.
John Brown came to Harper's Ferry because of the United States Armory and Arsenal. There were 100,000 weapons stored in 2 arsenal buildings here at Harper's Ferry. Brown intended to utilize those weapons to bring about an end of slavery throughout the South. And Harper's Ferry would be the beginning of that liberation. Brown had convinced himself that he was an instrument of God, that he had been sent here by Jehovah with the Bible as his creed to declare war against slavery.
Just after midnight, Brown's men killed Hayward Shepherd, a free black who worked for the railroad. Dawn, they seized 24 armory workers as they reported for work. But then Brown let a train from Wheeling pass through town, and its conductor quickly spread the alarm. Units of the Virginia militia arrived that afternoon and killed Dangerfield Newby, an ex-slave. Newby had joined Brown with the hope of freeing his wife and children who were still in bondage. Someone cut off his ears as souvenirs. 3 more of Brown's men were killed in sporadic fighting. Townspeople shot at 2 of the lifeless bodies throughout the day. The 3rd was partially eaten by a hog. That night, 90 United States Marines arrived from Washington. They were led by Robert E. Lee, a 52-year-old Army colonel. At dawn the next day, Lee demanded that Brown surrender. When he refused, Marines battered a hole in the engine house door.
And the first man through was a Marine, Lieutenant Israel Green. He struck Brown and pushed him down. The sword did not penetrate. Brown was wearing a buckle, and the sword had struck that buckle with such force that instead of penetrating, it almost broken it in half. And this is where history becomes a matter of a 1/4 of an inch. A 1/4 of an inch high or low, or a 1/4 of an inch to the right or to the left, away from that buckle. That sword would have penetrated Brown, and he would have died on that very cold brick floor.
Lieutenant Green clubbed Brown unconscious, and his small army surrendered. As Brown was carried out of the engine house, a hushed silence fell on the crowd that had gathered.
No one can feel any sympathy for Brown after they see the dreadful instruments he had prepared to kill us with. I had one of the spikes in my hand and examined it. They are made rough and coarse. They were for the Negroes to use. Oh, he is a dreadful man. May the Lord have mercy on him, for man cannot. Molly Hansford.
The death toll of the raid was 16, including 1 Marine and 2 of Brown's sons. In the Jefferson County Courthouse in Charlestown, Brown and his 4 surviving followers were put on trial for murder, treason against Virginia, and inciting slaves to riot. Special Prosecutor Andrew Hunter vowed to have Brown tried, sentenced, and hung, all within 10 days. 3 days later, Brown was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. The judge asked if he had any final words.
I so interfered in behalf of any of the rich, the powerful, or in behalf of any of their friends, it would have been all right. And every man in this court would have deemed it an act of reward rather than punishment. I believe that to have interfered as I have done in behalf of his despised poor is no wrong, but right. John Brown.
Virginia Governor Henry Wise received hundreds of letters requesting clemency for Brown. Fearing a revolt, Wise declared martial law in Charlestown and ordered strangers arrested on sight. Brown's wife Mary arrived from Kansas. In his jail cell, they talked for several hours. Then Mary left to await delivery of her husband's body. On December 2nd, reporters from across the country, including David Hunter Strawther, joined 1,500 soldiers around a gallows outside Charlestown. Cadets from the Virginia Military Institute were issued new muskets from the Harper's Ferry arsenal and told to prepare for any emergency. Their commander was Major Thomas J. Jackson, a pious, eccentric West Point graduate from Western Virginia.
I was much impressed with the thought that before me stood a man in the full vigor of health who must in a few moments enter eternity. I sent up the petition that he might be saved. I hoped that he was prepared to die, but I am doubtful. Thomas Jackson.
At 11:30 a.m., a sheriff cut the trapdoor rope with a hatchet, and John Brown fell to his death.
John Brown carved a canyon, a grand canyon, between the North and the South. No longer could you stand on top of the fence and not top either for slavery or against slavery. Brown took away the opportunity for compromise.
This will be the date of a new revolution, wrote Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, quite as much needed as the old one. In November of 1860, an Illinois congressman was elected the 16th President of the United States. A moderate on slavery, Abraham Lincoln's election sent shockwaves through the South. South Carolina seceded from the Union, followed soon by 6 other states. Virginia hesitated.
I am strong for the Union at present, and if things become no worse, I hope to continue so. Thomas Jackson.
In any aspect we view the existing state of things in Virginia, nothing but confusion, conflict, and strife foreboded. Archibald Campbell.
Newspaper editor Archibald Campbell, the nephew of Alexander Campbell, had fallen in with abolitionists while at college in New York. Now he began using his paper, the Wheeling Intelligencer, to rally public support for the creation of a new state, free of slavery, in Western Virginia.
There is now on foot a grand counter-movement, having for its object a division of the state at the Blue Ridge. This popular movement awaits only the opportunity and pretext for assuming formidable proportions.
Then, on April 12, 1861, Confederate guns fired on Fort Sumter. The new united demonstrations in Richmond. An exuberant crowd tore down the stars and stripes from atop the Capitol. Inside, a special convention debated Virginia's secession. Western delegate John S. Carlisle, a failed businessman who had become an eloquent political showman, led the fight against secession. Carlisle is an enemy, wrote the Richmond Enquirer, against whom we warn the true men of Virginia.
Dissolve the Union and hitch Virginia to the tail of a Southern Confederacy to stand guard for King Cotton. I drop the pen. I cannot contemplate the picture. I turn with horror from such a sight. John Carlisle.
Waitman T. Willey, a self-taught lawyer from Monongalia County who had set his slaves free, warned that Virginia would break apart if it left the Union.
The idea of a division of the state is new to the people. But I've never known so rapid a progress of opinion in favor of any measure as there seems to be in favor of this. Waitman Willey.
A Western farmer put it more directly. We will not fight for the ligatures, he warned. Happen what will. On April 15th, Lincoln issued a call for troops. 2 days later, former Governor Henry Wise entered the Virginia Convention, drew a pistol from his shirt, and announced that the state militia had seized the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry.
Order! Gentlemen, order!
That evening, the convention passed an ordinance of secession removing Virginia from the Union. Militia forces at Harper's Ferry were put under the command of Colonel Thomas Jackson, who had not hesitated in siding with his native Virginia. Orphaned at a young age, Jackson was raised on his uncle's farm at Jackson's Mill on the West Fork River. He had poor eyesight, was partially deaf, and suffered from numerous ailments, which he said were punishments from God for his sins. Obsessed with his health, Jackson refused to drink tea or coffee, ate fruit only in the morning, and often held up an arm so blood could flow back into his body.
People who are anxious to bring on war don't know what they are bargaining for. They don't see all the horrors that must accompany such an event. Thomas Jackson.
In May, Confederates led by Colonel George A. Porterfield occupied Grafton, a strategic junction of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, 80 miles southeast of Wheeling. In response, Union General George B. McClellan, a skilled engineer who had worked briefly for the B&O Railroad, sent federal troops across the Ohio River.
To Union men of Western Virginia, now that we are in your midst, I call upon you to fly to arms and sever the connection that binds you to traitors. Proclaim to the world that faith and loyalty so long boasted by the Old Dominion is still preserved in Western Virginia. George McClellan.
McClellan ordered General Benjamin Kelly, who had been selling hardware only a month earlier, to retake Grafton. Outnumbered, Porterfield withdrew south to Philippi and encamped beside the Buchanan River. Kelly advanced, and at dawn on June 3rd, Union cannon opened fire.
We were startled by a loud explosion with the cry, "The enemy! The enemy!" The balls were falling and hissing all around us. All was now confusion. The infantry was rushing toward Dixie's Land in great disorder. Private John Lyon Hill.
The first land battle of the Civil War was over in a few minutes. No one was killed, but Kelly was seriously wounded in the chest. Federal troops pursued the fleeing Confederates in what became known as the Philippi Races. In June, Union forces advanced toward Jackson's troops at Harper's Ferry. Jackson, now sporting a full beard, dismantled the Federal Armory, sent its machinery to Richmond, and set the building on fire. Then he withdrew. On his way out of town, Jackson blew up the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Bridge.
Jackson certainly was not comfortable with destroying property in Virginia, but Jackson was a warrior. Those were simply the results of war. A war he did not want, a war that any other Virginians did not desire. But now that he had thrown his hat in with the Confederacy, he would execute the edicts of war. And if that war brought death, misery, and destruction, so be it.
Only one armory building escaped destruction, the engine house, now called John Brown's Fort.
The appearance of ruin by war and fire was awful. Charred ruins were all that remained of the splendid public works. Arsenals, stores, hotels, and houses all mingled in one common destruction.
David Hunter Strother.
Recently married, David Hunter Strother had returned with his bride to his father's hotel at Berkeley Springs, planning to sit out the war. Now, with fighting so near, Strother realized that was impossible and promptly enlisted in the Union Army.
Volunteering in Monongalia moves very tardily. Each man thinks he is no one to do the fighting, but would rather do the talking. The men of means stood off, as if they had no lot or part in this matter, but seemed to think the poor man ought to do the fighting. James Evans.
The great majority of people did not want to take an absolute position. They wanted the problem to go away. But as often happens in periods that we look back and call great moments in history, in fact, public affairs intruded into private lives, and they required people to make a choice. They made it quickly, they made it slowly, they stuck with it, they backed out of it, but everybody had to make private decisions in response to this crisis in public affairs.
"19-year-old Joshua Winters left his family's farm near the Ohio River for a Union camp 200 miles to the east. It was the farthest he had ever been from home.
There are 16 of us in one tent. We have a stove in the middle, and we get along first rate at night. When we all get it cutting up, we have a great time. There's an awful sight of men here now, and more are coming. Joshua Winters.
In Wheeling, 3 brothers enlisted. 1 with the Union, and 2 with the Confederacy.
I have been putting the last finishing touches to poor Sill's clothes, marking his shirts and stockings. My dear, dear husband, I clung to him with tears and sobs which I could not repress. The last lingering kiss and embrace was given, and he went from my sight, and perhaps forever. Marcia Phillips.
20-year-old James Hall of Philippi left college and joined the Barber Grays.
I have volunteered in the Confederate Army. I cannot visualize the stern realities of war. Scenes of carnage and death await. Be it so. We will consider our lives a small offering for our native land. May God avert the danger which now threatens her. James Hall.
As the war intensified, pro-Union leaders meeting in the Custom House at Wheeling declared the Richmond government null and void. They formed the reorganized government of Virginia, with Wheeling as its capital, and named a new Virginia governor loyal to the Union. Francis Harrison Pierpont, a former school teacher and lawyer for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, vowed to raise more Union troops, despite the fact that his government had no money.
The putting down of the rebellion is of vastly more importance to us and to the world than the formation of a new seat. Francis Pierpont.
He secured bank loans, permanently guaranteeing the notes, and seized $27,000 intended for a new state insane asylum. Within a month, Pierpont had recruited and equipped 20,000 Union volunteers.
Frank Pierpont is one of those men well fitted for the stormy and revolutionary times that are upon us. A truer man to the cause of the Union does not live. Archibald Campbell.
Determined to maintain the standards of the governor's office, Pierpont bought himself a tailored suit to replace what he called his homespun clothes. But he refused to employ a black servant and had the uniform bought for one returned.
We enjoy this life very much. So healthy and so pretty a country is rarely seen. This is the land of blackberries. We are a great grown-up armed blackberry party, and we gather untold quantities. Rutherford B. Hayes.
A Harvard Law School graduate, Rutherford B. Hayes arrived in Western Virginia with the 23rd Ohio in the summer of 1861.
The people here are divided. Many of the leading ladies are secessionists. We meet many good Union men. The other men are prudently quiet.
In July, Union soldiers won a decisive victory at Rich Mountain in the Tigard Valley. At Gauley River in September, Federal troops defeated rebels under former Virginia Governor John B. Floyd. By the fall, Union forces controlled all of northwestern Virginia and most of the Kanawha Valley and the B&O Railroad. Rebels still held the Greenbrier and other southeastern valleys. In Greenbrier Valley, Confederate General Henry Wise set up his headquarters at White Sulphur Springs. Rebel soldiers signed the hotel's register alongside wealthy Southern guests who hadn't let a war stop their annual vacation. Yet for most Confederates encamped in the mountains, conditions couldn't have been worse. Food and supplies were scarce. It rained constantly, then snowed. Diseases spread. Pneumonia, mumps, then an epidemic of measles.
I entered the house, a deserted dwelling, which was filled with the sick. I saw many there who appeared so intellectual and highly educated, who undoubtedly were bright ornaments to society, leaving the world in such a place. I involuntarily breathed a prayer to their Creator, who knows all. James Hall.
Secure behind Union lines, Pierpont's government chose John S. Carlisle and Waitman T. Willey as United States Senators from loyal Virginia. Carlisle immediately called for the formation of a new state.
Borne down by an Eastern governmental majority, we have endured the disastrous results that ever must flow from an unnatural connection. Cut the knot now. Cut it now. Apply the knife. John Carlisle.
They view this as an opportunity. Here's our chance to assert our individuality, our independence, a new state. We West Virginians, this is our time has come. All these pent-up emotions and feelings and frustrations that have been building for 30, 40 years. Now we can do something. Our day has come.
Supporters haggled over the state's name, insisting New Virginia, Allegheny, then Kanawha.
The name Kanawha is a very hard name to spell. I think the rose would smell sweeter by some other name. Waitman Willey.
Finally, they compromised on West Virginia. The proposed new state contained 50 counties, including several in the Northeast, where the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad operated.
The inclusion of this territory is essential to the welfare of this new state. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad is the great artery that feeds our country. We cannot do without it.
Berkeley, Morgan, Hampshire counties, Jefferson County, those were tied very much to the old Virginia plantation economy. If they didn't go with the new state of West Virginia, part of the B&O would continue to operate through a Confederate state, through hostile territory. the United States government, the new government of West Virginia, the management of the B&O, pretty much everybody decided that it was in the best interests of everybody if the B&O lay entirely within this new state of West Virginia.
Thomas Jackson, now called Stonewall after the Battle of Manassas, occupied Berkeley Springs in January of 1862. There, his men ransacked the Strother Hotel. David Hunter Strother's father, distraught at the damage, died 2 weeks later. In the spring, Jackson led his troops on a brilliant campaign in the Shenandoah Valley, repeatedly defeating larger Union forces before disappearing into the hills. Jackson, who prayed 3 times a day, seemed fearless under fire. My religious beliefs teach me to feel as safe in battle as in bed, he told a fellow officer. God has fixed the time for my death. His fame spread, first throughout the South, then everywhere. On May 29, 1862, Waitman T. Willey presented West Virginia's application for statehood to the United States Senate.
The division of state of Virginia is a physical, a political, and commercial necessity. It is indispensable to the development of the great natural resources of West Virginia and to the prosperity and happiness of its inhabitants.
Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, the leading abolitionist, demanded that West Virginia only be admitted as a free state. Senator Carlisle insisted that residents of the state be given the choice over slavery.
Congress will hesitate long before it consents to the subdivision of a slave state, simply that 2 slave states may be made out of it. Archibald Campbell.
Willey proposed an amendment providing for the gradual elimination of slavery in the new state. The Senate passed the statehood bill with Willey's amendment attached. Carlisle voted against it. Carlisle's supporters were shocked. His conversion is greater than that of St. Paul, said a colleague.
Carlisle has run himself clear underwater. The people would have forgiven him almost anything except his vote against the new state. Chester Hubbard.
The most lively topic here, wrote a Wheeling woman, is the detestation of Carlisle.
John Carlisle probably never understood why he was rejected, why he became an object of complete scorn. He didn't like the Willey Amendment, which stated that West Virginia would have to become a free state before it could enter the Union. It wasn't, you see, that Carlisle objected to the new state. He didn't want a new state on the terms on which it was being offered. He could not adjust to change. And being unable to adjust to change, he willingly consigned himself to oblivion.
The statehood bill passed in the House of Representatives in December and was sent to President Lincoln for his signature. Lincoln worried that the bill violated a provision in the Constitution that said no state could be divided against its will. In giving its consent, Lincoln wondered, had the Wheeling government spoken for Virginia?
Mr. President, as your friend, as an original, unconditional, and unchangeable Union man, I say that you never afford to veto this new state bill. A veto would be the death warrant of unionism in Western Virginia. Very sincerely and respectfully, Archibald Campbell.
Pierpont threatened to resign if Lincoln vetoed the bill. Finally, on December 31st, Lincoln signed it. The division of a state is dreaded as a precedent, he said, but a measure made expedient by a war is no precedent for times of peace.
Lincoln couldn't have done anything else but sign the statehood bill. And one of the things he talks about is that we need every West Virginian, every mother's son, to fight in the Union Army, to volunteer. We need West Virginia regiments already in the field to re-volunteer. I mean, he's very conscious that if he hadn't signed the bill, this would have been so disappointing that he would have lost the support, perhaps, of the populace.
West Virginia became the 35th state in the Union, and the only one torn from the body of another.
Hard it is at this old camp chase, nothing to eat, nothing to drink, nothing to do but dig out in the cold ground, and it's hard times. We could cut a pine plank in two in a minute and make our escape just as we begin it. But we're waiting for old Abe and old Jeff to arrange so that our prisoners can be exchanged, and it's hard times. Then we'll go back to old Stonewall Jack. We'll get a permit and we'll go and bushwhacking. It's hard times. We'll kill all those Yanks and take all their goods. Then we'll skedaddle back into the woods, and it's hard times.
In 1863, as Union and Confederate armies in Western Virginia were locked in a military stalemate, a second war emerged. A war without uniforms or codes of conduct. Farmers, boys, and deserters formed irregular Confederate units with colorful names. The Moccasins, the Black Striped Company, McNeil's Rangers. In Logan County, Anderson Hatfield and two of his brothers formed the Logan Wildcats. The Hatfields picked off dozens of Union soldiers, including one of their neighbors, Private Harmon McCoy.
The country outside our lines is full of guerrillas and horse thieves. The staid people wish them to the devil, although their own friends and relatives are among the plunderers.
David Hunter Strother.
Called bushwhackers by their Union enemies, the guerrillas harassed federal troops and terrorized Union supporters. Bushwhackers beheaded one federal courier. Another was found tied to a tree, his naked body riddled with bullets.
The guerrilla warfare simply shows the inability of the Union Army really to govern or to control Western Virginia. Northwestern Virginia, where the population was already committed to Union, there was no problem. But the rest state could not be governed. Union troops controlled the cities and the roadways and the rivers during the day, but not at night. The terrain itself was enough to defeat any invading army. 30 men well placed in a mountain gorge could hold off a regiment, an army.
We now have over 40,000 men in the service of the United States in Western Virginia. But our large armies are useless here. They cannot catch guerrillas in the mountains any more than a cow can catch fleas. Robert Milroy.
Union General Robert H. Milroy ordered Confederate sympathizers to pay for goods stolen by bushwhackers. If they refused, soldiers were to burn their houses, seize their property, and shoot them. Union soldiers occupied towns, declared martial law, then ransacked stores and houses.
We were engaged all day for the insolent conduct of a company of cavalry who seemed to have taken complete possession of the town. We have no privacy whatever. Our yard and garden are no longer our own, and we are like prisoners. Henrietta Barr.
A company of guerrillas came into our store and took possession in the name of Southern Confederacy and intended to rob the store of everything and did take about $1,000 worth of goods, Confederate rags. Nancy Hunt.
The Civil War was one of the most divisive and disruptive aspects of the history of West Virginia that one can possibly imagine. A true civil war occurred in the mountains where one had families and communities divided against each other.
A great share of the calamities of war fall on women. I see women unused to hard labor, gathering corn to keep starvation from the door. Rutherford B. Hayes.
In Philippi, Anna Jarvis, who had lost 3 of her 4 children to disease, organized Mother's Day work clubs that provided food and medicine to women impoverished by the war. Joshua Winter's mother and sisters managed the farm on their own.
Dear brother, you don't believe how lonesome we are. I chopped wood yesterday till I had a blister on my hand. Julia is a great big mare, big enough to ride if she was broke. I wish you would come home and break her so I could ride her. Don't forget your loving sister, Annie.
Such a time our new state is having. Lots of rebels trying to destroy it. But never mind. It will shine as bright as any of the 35 after a while. If I were only a man to help fight for it. Cyrene Bunton.
Both sides recruited women as spies. In Martinsburg, Belle Boyd claimed she obtained information from Union officers in the privacy of her bedroom. The Confederate officers said Boyd could charm the heart out of a monk and cause him to break his vows of celibacy. Boyd was arrested 7 times, each time boasting of her deeds and delighting in the public outrage.
Belle Boyd was taken prisoner and sent off in a carriage with an escort of 50 cavalrymen today. I hope she has succeeded in making herself proficiently notorious now. Lucy Buck.
On the night of May 2nd, 1863, Thomas Jackson was returning to his camp outside Chancellorsville, Virginia, when he was mistaken for a Union soldier and shot by his own men. For a week, Jackson struggled to recover. Then, on May 10th, a warm spring day, Jackson closed his eyes. "Let us cross over the river," he said, "and rest under the shade of the trees." few moments later, he died. Southerners were heartbroken. In Richmond, 5,000 people met the train carrying Jackson's body. Thousands more filed past his coffin as it lay in state. In death, Jackson became even more famous. He was taken away from us, said a soldier, because we almost made an idol out of him.
So common has death become that when a man dies, he is as soon forgotten. Yesterday I passed by the graveyard of our regiment. Their pure souls shall forever stand unmoved during the wreck of time and crush of worlds. James Hall.
In May of 1864, David Hunter assumed command of Union forces in West Virginia. Hunter ordered his troops to burn the property of Southern sympathizers every time they were fired upon by bushwhackers. Federal soldiers promptly torched the homes of a parson and a widow. Hunter advanced south and occupied Lexington, where he set fire to the Virginia Military Institute. His chief of staff, David Hunter Strother, had a statue of Washington removed from the school and sent to Wheeling as a trophy for the new state. Two weeks later, at White Sulphur Springs, Hunter gave orders to burn down the White, which had been converted into a Confederate hospital. Captain Henry DuPont, a regular guest at the resort, talked him out of it. Hunter moved north to Charlestown, where he set fire to the home of his cousin, Andrew Hunter, the prosecutor of John Brown. When Lincoln received reports of Hunter's actions, he relieved him of his command. On his final day, Hunter had a Union deserter shot. "It is too troublesome to hang men," he said. "We have not time to spare."
What a terrible thing this war is. It has shaken everything to the foundation. One thing is evident. The future will be very different from the past. Martha Watson.
By the end of 1864, the tide had turned against the South. Union forces controlled nearly all of West Virginia. Sherman was sweeping from Atlanta towards the sea. Grant pressing down on Lee in Petersburg. Bushwhackers continued to fight, but it became only a matter of time. On the night of April 8, 1865, Cavalry Private William L. Wilson of Charlestown bedded down with his company near Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia.
There is an air of repose and security about camp tonight which I cannot understand. Are we safe at last? My thoughts turn homewards. When will I ever see the blue mountains and green fields of Jefferson again? Private William L. Wilson,
The next day, Lee surrendered to Grant in a farmhouse outside the village.
We marched out within the Yankee lines this morning and stacked our arms. I saw several acquaintances in the Yankee Army. Some of my neighbors. James Hall.
They came home. Privates, generals, Union, Confederate. Home to wives and mothers, to neighbors they had met in battle. Home to a state that hadn't existed when they left. Union Private Joshua Winters returned to family's farm and took his sister Annie horseback riding. Anderson Hatfield disbanded the Logan Wildcats and was hailed as a local hero. McNeil's Rangers surrendered everything but their saddles and a few new rifles. One ranger asked if he could keep some gunpowder to go hunting. Anna Jarvis lost 3 more children to disease and died on the second Sunday in May. Through her daughter's efforts, the day became a national holiday, Mother's Day. David Hunter Strother returned to Berkeley Springs, where he managed his family's hotel and resumed his writing. His war memoir was serialized in Harper's Magazine.
Will one day be considered a great privilege to have lived in these days, to have played a part in the greatest war that has shaken the earth for many a year.
In Washington, Senator Wakeman T. Willey personally handled hundreds of claims for compensation from victims of the war and fought off efforts by Richmond politicians to reunite Virginia. John S. Carlisle moved to Maryland, ran for Congress as a Democrat, and lost. Then returned to Clarksburg and ran as a Republican. He lost again and became a farmer. Confederate James Hall, who had been wounded at Gettysburg, began the long journey home from Appomattox.
April 15th. Today we separated. The majority of us will never meet again. April 18th. Slept in a bed last night, the first in many months. April 24th. Came to Philippi and stopped with Aunt Betsy Jarvis. April 28th. Went fishing. James Hall.
happened in the mountains as a result of industrialization is that mountain people very quickly moved from a relatively independent people who had a large amount of control over their own destiny and lives to a people who were increasingly dependent and whose lives were shaped by external markets and external owners. Appalachia essentially became a dependent society, dependent